Montana Territory, 1878. The sunset painted the big sky in streaks of copper and gold as Samuel Everett made his final ride into Big Timber. 3 years running the mail between settlements had left him lean and weathered, his once soft hands now calloused from reins and rifle. He touched the small bundle of letters tucked inside his coat, mail that wouldn't be delivered, and nudged his horse forward, keeping his eyes fixed on the narrow trail ahead. Samuel had learned early that men like him didn't survive by looking others in the eye too long. 17 years of breathing meant 17 years of guarding a secret that would get him killed if known. He'd seen what happened to men suspected of unnatural affections, had watched a mob drag one poor soul behind a horse in Cheyenne when Sam was just 14. The lesson had burned itself into his bones. Stay moving, stay silent, stay alone. The postmaster position in Sweetwater Creek offered what Samuel needed most: isolation. A cabin 5 miles outside a town too small to have a sheriff, where he could disappear into the rhythm of sorting mail and checking his carefully maintained maps. He would be the quiet, reserved postal clerk who kept to himself, and no one would think to ask why a young man chose solitude over seeking a wife. Better lonesome than dead, Samuel muttered to his horse as they crested the final ridge before Sweetwater Creek came into view. The settlement was barely visible, just a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from a handful of chimneys. His future, his hiding place. What Samuel didn't say, even to his horse, was how the nights stretched endless and cold, or how sometimes he watched couples walking arm in arm with a hunger that felt like starvation. He never admitted aloud that part of him still believed what his father had preached, that his desires were a moral failing that damned him to hell and ostracism in equal measure. The trail down to Sweetwater Creek followed alongside a bubbling stream that swelled to a proper creek as it reached the valley. Samuel let his mare pick her way carefully down the rocky path as sunset faded to twilight. His body ached from weeks in the saddle, but the postmaster position would end that too. No more long rides, no more constant vigilance against robbers and weather. Just quiet, safe isolation. He was so absorbed in thoughts of his new life that he almost missed the sound, a low groan from somewhere near the water. Samuel reined his horse to a stop, listening. The groan came again, unmistakably human. "Hello," he called, hand moving to his revolver. No response came, but another pained sound. Samuel dismounted cautiously, tying his horse to a scrub pine before approaching the creek bank. The fading light made it difficult to see, but there, half collapsed against a boulder, was a man. The stranger's hat had fallen beside him, revealing dark hair plastered to his forehead. His clothes were travel-stained, and a large pack lay nearby. One hand clutched weakly at his side, and even in the dim light, Samuel could see the man's face was flushed with fever. "Can you hear me, mister?" Samuel knelt beside him, keeping a cautious distance. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of a summer storm. "Water," he rasped, then his eyes rolled back as consciousness slipped away from him. Samuel hesitated only a moment before dipping his bandana in the creek and pressing it to the stranger's parched lips. The man was burning with fever, and Samuel recognized the signs of a wound gone bad. He'd seen enough men die on the trail to know the look of approaching death. "Damn it all," Samuel muttered, knowing he couldn't leave a man to die alone by a creek. With considerable effort, he managed to lift the unconscious stranger and carry him to his horse. The man was tall but frighteningly light, as though the fever had already begun consuming him from within. After securing the stranger's pack to his saddle, Samuel mounted his mare and carefully arranged the unconscious man in front of him. The stranger's head lolled back against Samuel's shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is precisely what I don't need," Samuel told the unconscious man as they continued toward Sweetwater Creek. "A complication on my first day." The postmaster's cabin came into view just as full darkness descended, a sturdy one-room structure set back from the main settlement. Samuel's arms ached from supporting the stranger's weight by the time he dismounted and carried him inside. The cabin was spare but clean, with a narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove in the center. Samuel laid the unconscious man on the bed and lit the oil lamp before examining him properly. The stranger was perhaps 2 or 3 years older than Samuel, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' stubble. His breathing remained shallow and fast, and when Samuel unbuttoned the man's shirt to look for the wound, he found an angry, festering gash across his ribs. "You've been carrying this for days," Samuel said quietly, noting the crude attempt at stitching that had failed to prevent infection. He retrieved his saddlebags and pulled out a small kit of medical supplies, necessities for a man who often rode alone. As Samuel cleaned the wound, the stranger's eyes flickered open again. This time they focused briefly on Samuel's face. "Am I dead yet?" he whispered. "Not yet," Samuel replied, continuing to work, "though you've been trying your best from the look of things." A ghost of a smile touched the man's cracked lips. They said, "The postmaster might help." Samuel's hands stilled, who said. But the man had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving Samuel with nothing but questions and a stranger dying in what was supposed to be his fresh start. Throughout the night, Samuel battled the stranger's fever with cool compresses and cleaned the wound repeatedly. By dawn, he'd managed to get some water and a few spoonfuls of broth into the man, though consciousness remained fleeting at best. As morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, Samuel studied the stranger's face. Even gaunt with illness, there was something compelling about his features, a gentleness around the mouth that contrasted with the weathered hands of a working man. Samuel caught himself tracing the line of the stranger's jaw with his gaze and quickly looked away, busying himself with building up the fire. A knock at the door startled him. Samuel quickly pulled a blanket over the stranger's exposed chest before opening the door to find an older man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Mr. Everett, I'm Howard Watson, town council. Came to welcome you and make sure you found everything in order." The man peered curiously over Samuel's shoulder. "I see you've got company already." Samuel stepped onto the porch, partially closing the door behind him. "Found a man collapsed with fever by the creek last night. Couldn't leave him to die." Watson nodded approvingly. "Good Christian charity. Need any help with him? Widow Parker has some nursing experience." "No," Samuel said too quickly, then moderated his tone. "Thank you, but I've dealt with trail fevers before. Better not to expose others if it's catching." After Watson departed with promises to return in a few days, Samuel slumped against the door. Bringing attention to himself on his first day was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. He glanced at the unconscious man on his bed and sighed. "You're nothing but trouble," he told the stranger, who predictably didn't respond. It was midday when the stranger finally awoke with clarity in his eyes. Samuel was spooning broth into his mouth when the man's hand suddenly caught his wrist. "Where am I?" The voice was stronger than before, though still rough from fever. "Postmaster's cabin in Sweetwater Creek," Samuel answered, gently extracting his wrist from the man's surprisingly strong grip. "I found you half dead by the creek yesterday evening." The stranger attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan. "Stephen Walsh," he offered after catching his breath. "Most folks call me Walsh." "Samuel Everett, most folks don't call me anything, as I prefer it that way." Walsh's lips quirked into a weak smile. "Yet you took in a dying stranger." Samuel busied himself with the broth to avoid those too perceptive eyes. "Couldn't leave you for the coyotes. What happened to you?" Walsh was silent long enough that Samuel thought he might have fallen asleep again, but when he looked up, those storm-gray eyes were watching him intently. "Ran into some disagreement about property rights," Walsh finally said. "3 men felt entitled to my horse and gear. I disagreed, but one got lucky with a knife before I convinced them otherwise." "And you've been riding with that wound how long?" 4 days, maybe 5, Walsh closed his eyes. "Started seeing things yesterday. Creek water looked like it was on fire. Then you appeared like some avenging angel, and I thought for sure I was hallucinating." Samuel snorted. "I'm no angel, just the unfortunate soul who found you." "Lucky for me then." Walsh's voice was fading as exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. "They said to find the new postmaster if I needed help." "Who said?" Samuel asked sharply, but Walsh was already asleep. For 3 days, Samuel tended to Walsh while attempting to establish his new routine at the post office, a small addition to the general store. He sorted mail, updated his maps, and returned each midday and evening to check on his patient, who spent most of the time sleeping as the fever gradually receded. On the 4th morning, Samuel entered the cabin to find the bed empty. Panic surged through him until he spotted Walsh sitting at the table, shirtless except for the bandages around his torso, attempting to shave with Samuel's straight razor. "You shouldn't be up," Samuel said, closing the door behind him. Walsh glanced over with a half-smile, his face partly covered in soap. "Been lying down long enough. Thought I'd try to look human again before I impose on you further." Samuel approached cautiously, noting how Walsh's hand trembled slightly. "Let me," he said before he could think better of it, taking the razor from Walsh's hand. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Samuel forced himself not to react to the sudden warmth that crawled up his arm from the contact. He positioned himself beside Walsh, tilting the man's chin up with one hand. Hold still, Samuel instructed, his voice rougher than intended. He worked in silence, the razor making soft scraping sounds as it revealed clean skin beneath the soap and stubble. Walsh's eyes never left his face, and Samuel focused intently on his task, afraid of what his own expression might reveal. "You've done this before," Walsh observed quietly. Samuel didn't respond immediately, carefully navigating the razor around the strong curve of Walsh's jaw. "Had a younger brother, taught him to shave before I left home." "Where's home?" "Nowhere anymore." Samuel wiped the razor clean on a cloth. "Tilt your head back." Walsh complied, exposing the vulnerable line of his throat. Samuel swallowed hard, steadying his hand as he drew the razor carefully down the tanned skin. "Thank you," Walsh said when he'd finished, "for all of this. I was pretty far gone when you found me." Samuel rinsed the razor, acutely aware of Walsh watching him. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Walsh said with quiet certainty, "they wouldn't have." Samuel turned to find Walsh standing much closer than expected, his bare chest just inches away. Something in the man's gaze made Samuel step back quickly, nearly knocking over the wash basin. "You should rest more," Samuel said stiffly. "I need to get back to the post office." He fled the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. The way Walsh had looked at him, it was too familiar, too knowing. Samuel had spent his life avoiding that precise kind of recognition, the silent communication between men like him that could lead to connection but more often led to danger. Samuel spent the day mechanically sorting mail, his mind returning to the cabin and its occupant. No one had ever looked at him the way Walsh had, as though they could see past every carefully constructed barrier to the truth beneath. It terrified him. When he returned that evening, the cabin smelled of coffee and something savory. Walsh had managed to dress himself in clean clothes from his pack and stood stirring something in Samuel's small cooking pot. "Hope you don't mind," Walsh said without turning around. "Figured I owed you dinner at least. It's just beans and salt pork, but it's hot." Samuel hung his hat by the door, uncertain how to react to the domestic scene before him. "You should be resting, not cooking." Walsh turned then, a wooden spoon in hand. "I've been resting for days. Besides, my mother taught me never to be an ungrateful guest." They ate at the small table, and despite Samuel's determination to maintain distance, he found himself relaxing as Walsh told stories of his travels through the Western Territories. The man had an easy way about him, humor laced through his words even when describing hardships. "So what brings you to Sweetwater Creek?" Walsh asked as they finished eating. "It's not exactly a bustling metropolis." Samuel stacked their empty plates. "The position was available. I wanted somewhere quiet." "Running from something." Samuel stiffened. "No, just prefer solitude." Walsh studied him for a long moment. "That's a shame," he finally said, his voice dropping lower. "Some things are worth the risk of company." The air between them seemed to thicken. Samuel stood abruptly, gathering the dishes. "You should take the bed again tonight. I'll use my bedroll." "Samuel," Walsh's voice stopped him as he turned away. "The men who told me to find the postmaster if I needed help, they were friends of Dorothy." Samuel froze, the plates clutched in his hands. Friends of Dorothy was a phrase he'd heard only twice before, both times from men like him, a code to identify themselves to each other without risking exposure. "I don't know what you mean," Samuel said carefully. Walsh sighed. "Yes, you do. The former postmaster here, Jenkins, he was one too, had a cabin up in the hills with his business partner. They said the new postmaster would be sympathetic." Samuel set the dishes down with deliberate care. "You're mistaken," he said, not turning around, "and you should be well enough to travel in a day or two." "Samuel, I think we both need sleep," Samuel cut him off, unrolling his bedding as far from the bed as the small cabin allowed. That night Samuel lay awake listening to Walsh's steady breathing, his mind in turmoil. Someone had specifically sent Walsh here to him, believing Samuel would be sympathetic to men who loved men. It meant his secret wasn't a secret at all to some, that he'd been marked and identified before he even arrived. The realization made his stomach clench with fear. If some knew, others might learn. The isolation he'd sought might already be compromised, yet beneath the fear lurked something else, a treacherous hope that perhaps, for once, he wasn't entirely alone. In the morning, Samuel left before Walsh woke, needing distance to clear his head. He threw himself into work at the post office, reorganizing shelves that didn't need organizing and redrawing map sections that were perfectly accurate. By mid-afternoon, his determined focus was interrupted by the sight of Walsh entering the small post office, moving slowly but steadily. Samuel straightened behind the counter, acutely aware of Mrs. Foster sorting through mail nearby. "Mr. Everett," Walsh greeted him with formal politeness. "I wondered if you had any mail for Stephen Walsh." "I've been expecting correspondence." Samuel played along with the charade, checking through the sorted letters. "Nothing today, Mr. Walsh." Walsh nodded, leaning slightly against the counter. Though he stood straight, Samuel could see the effort it cost him. "I'll check again tomorrow then. By the way, I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. I've taken a room at the boarding house." Samuel looked up sharply. "You're not well enough." "I'm well enough," Walsh interrupted smoothly. "Mrs. Thornton has been most accommodating." Mrs. Foster perked up at this, turning toward them. "Oh, you're the gentleman Mr. Everett rescued, Mrs. Thornton mentioned a new boarder. Will you be staying in Sweetwater Creek long, Mr. Walsh?" Walsh offered her a charming smile. "That depends on opportunity, ma'am. I've been considering settling somewhere suitable." His eyes flicked briefly to Samuel before returning to Mrs. Foster, and Samuel felt heat rise in his face. "Good day, Mr. Everett," Walsh said, tipping his hat. "Thank you again for your assistance." Samuel watched him leave with a mixture of relief and dismay. Walsh moving to the boarding house was safer for both of them. No more dangerous proximity in the small cabin, no more risk of Samuel revealing himself through unguarded glances or words. Yet the prospect of returning to an empty cabin filled him with a hollow ache he hadn't anticipated. Over the next week, Walsh established himself in the small community with apparent ease. He helped repair the church roof, assisted the blacksmith with a difficult horse, and charmed Mrs. Thornton into preparing special meals for him as he recovered. Samuel watched it all from a careful distance, speaking to Walsh only when they happened to cross paths in town. Each brief encounter left Samuel more unsettled than the last. Walsh never pushed or pressured, yet his eyes held a steady invitation that Samuel struggled to ignore. More concerning were the times Samuel caught Walsh in conversation with Jenkins, the former postmaster who now ran the livery stable with his business partner, a burly man named Miller. 10 days after Walsh's arrival in Sweetwater Creek, a heavy spring storm descended on the valley. Samuel closed the post office early as thunder rolled across the darkening sky and hurried back to his cabin through the first fat drops of rain. He was halfway through preparing a simple supper when a knock came at his door. Samuel opened it to find Walsh standing in the downpour, his coat already soaked through. "Evening," Walsh said, water dripping from his hat brim. "Thought you might want company for the storm." Samuel hesitated, then stepped back to let him in. "Mrs. Thornton's boarding house has a roof, last I checked." Walsh removed his dripping hat and coat, hanging them by the door. "It does, along with 5 other boarders who talk incessantly. I told her I was checking on you, being new to the territory and all." Samuel returned to the stove, stirring the pot of beans to hide his discomfort. "I've weathered storms before." "I'm sure you have." Walsh moved to stand beside the stove, close enough that Samuel could feel the damp chill radiating from his clothes. "But I thought perhaps you might want someone to weather this one with you." Samuel glanced up to find Walsh watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Outside, thunder crashed closer, rattling the cabin's windows. "Why are you really here?" Samuel asked, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Walsh took a step closer. "You know why." "It's dangerous," Samuel whispered. "Living is dangerous," Walsh countered. "Dying alone is certain." Before Samuel could respond, Walsh reached out slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and placed a hand against his cheek. The touch was gentle, questioning, and it broke something loose inside Samuel that he'd kept chained for years. Samuel closed the distance between them, pressing his mouth to Walsh's with desperate hunger. Walsh responded immediately, arms encircling Samuel to pull him closer as the kiss deepened. Samuel clutched at Walsh's shirt, a sound somewhere between a groan and a sob escaping him as years of denial crumbled under the onslaught of touch and taste and need. They broke apart only when thunder crashed directly overhead, startling them both. Walsh's eyes were dark with desire, his breathing as ragged as Samuel's own. "I've wanted to do that since I first woke to see you beside my bed," Walsh admitted, his hands still resting on Samuel's waist. Samuel swallowed hard. "I've never," he began, then stopped. "I mean, I've known what I am, but I've never." Understanding dawned in Walsh's eyes, never acted on it. Samuel nodded, unable to meet Walsh's gaze. Too dangerous. I saw what happens to men like us. Walsh lifted Samuel's chin gently. I know the danger, I've run from it all my life, but sometimes, Samuel, you find people you can trust. Places you can be yourself, at least behind closed doors. And you think Sweetwater Creek is such a place? Samuel asked, skepticism clear in his voice. I think it could be, Walsh said. Jenkins and Miller have lived here for 15 years. Everyone knows they share that cabin up in the hills, and no one asks questions. There are others too, not many, but enough to form a kind of protection for each other. Samuel pulled away, moving to the window to watch rain lashing against the glass. And what happens when someone new comes to town? Someone who does ask questions, or worse, doesn't need to ask because they recognize what we are. Walsh came to stand behind him, not touching but close enough that Samuel could feel his presence like a physical force. Then we watch out for each other, warn each other, sometimes move on if necessary. That's no way to live, Samuel said bitterly. It's better than not living at all, Walsh replied. Better than denying yourself every human connection out of fear. Samuel turned to face him. Is that what you think I've been doing? I think you've been surviving, Walsh said gently. I'm suggesting there might be more to life than just survival. The storm raged on as they ate together, the conversation shifting to safer topics. Walsh's travels through the territories, Samuel's years carrying mail, the quirks of Sweetwater Creek's residents. Yet underneath ran a current of tension, of possibility, that made every glance between them weighted with meaning. As the evening deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Walsh rose from his chair. I should get back to the boarding house. Samuel looked at the window where rain still poured in sheets. In this, you'll drown before you make it halfway. Walsh hesitated, and Samuel saw the careful calculation in his eyes, weighing risk against desire, propriety against need. You can stay, Samuel said quietly, making his choice. The bed's narrow, but we'll manage. They undressed in silence, Walsh turning his back to offer privacy that seemed absurd given what had already passed between them. Samuel slid beneath the blankets first, his heart pounding as Walsh extinguished the lamp and joined him. In the darkness, with thunder still rumbling in the distance, Samuel felt Walsh's arm slip around his waist, drawing him back against a solid chest. He tensed momentarily, then relaxed into the embrace, allowing himself to be held for the first time in memory. Just this, Walsh murmured against his hair, nothing more tonight. Samuel nodded, grateful for the understanding. They lay together as the storm gradually subsided, their breathing synchronizing in the darkness. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the iron bands of vigilance around his chest loosen, allowing him to draw a full, deep breath. Morning brought clear skies and a strange new domesticity as they shared coffee and the remains of last night's supper. Walsh departed with a brief touch to Samuel's hand, a gesture so small yet so laden with meaning that Samuel felt it like a brand on his skin. The next weeks passed in a delicate dance of public distance and private closeness. Walsh visited the post office regularly, their conversations proper and brief when others were present. But when Samuel returned to his cabin in the evenings, he increasingly found Walsh waiting, having slipped away from the boarding house with excuses of evening walks or errands. Behind closed doors, they discovered each other slowly. Samuel learned the story of the scar across Walsh's ribs, not from robbers as he'd initially claimed, but from the brother of a man Walsh had loved in Wyoming, who'd caught them together and tried to kill him. Walsh learned of Samuel's family in Missouri, who had disowned him when his father found a hidden letter from a boyhood friend that revealed too much of Samuel's heart. Their physical relationship developed with equal care, each step forward a revelation to Samuel. Walsh was patient, guiding without pushing, teaching Samuel to accept pleasure without shame. Nights when Walsh could stay became treasured islands in the sea of pretense that filled their days. Yet danger lurked at the edges of their fragile happiness. Samuel noticed the sideways glances from certain townspeople when he and Walsh spoke in public, nothing overtly hostile, but attentive in ways that made his old fears resurface. You're imagining things, Walsh insisted one evening as they lay together in Samuel's narrow bed. People here mind their business. Watson was asking about you today, Samuel countered. Wanted to know how long you plan to stay in town, what your business is. Walsh trailed his fingers along Samuel's bare shoulder. Natural curiosity. I've been here almost a month with no clear occupation. He mentioned his niece is visiting next month. Unmarried, thought you might like an introduction. Walsh chuckled. I'll politely decline. Men my age who haven't married yet aren't that unusual out here. Samuel propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at Walsh seriously. It only takes one person to suspect, to say something. Then others start watching, noticing patterns, who visits whom, who never courts the local girls. Walsh sighed, reaching up to brush hair from Samuel's forehead. We're careful. Jenkins and Miller have managed for 15 years. In a cabin 5 miles outside town where they see people once a week at most, Samuel pointed out, I'm the postmaster. Everyone comes to me. The conversation ended there, as most of their disagreements did, unresolved but set aside in favor of more immediate pleasures. Yet Samuel found his anxiety growing as spring warmed toward summer and Walsh showed no signs of moving on. The crisis came in late June, when a cattle buyer named Hargrove arrived in Sweetwater Creek. Samuel noticed him watching from the first day, a hard-eyed man with a Texas drawl who seemed to see too much. When Hargrove came to the post office, he lingered longer than necessary, asking pointed questions about the town's residents. Heard there's some unnatural types in these parts, Hargrove remarked casually on his third visit, leaning against Samuel's counter. Man I know over in Helena said this valley's got a reputation. Samuel kept his face carefully neutral. Can't say I've noticed anything unusual. Most folks here are just trying to make a living. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly. That's so. What about those two fellas run the livery, share a cabin I hear, no women around? Mr. Jenkins is a widower, Samuel replied evenly. Mr. Miller never married, common enough arrangement when housing is scarce. And that Walsh fella, Hargrove pressed, been here how long now with no clear purpose? Spends a fair bit of time around your office, doesn't he? Samuel's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Walsh helps with the mail run to outlying homesteads twice a week. As for his other business, you'd have to ask him. Hargrove straightened, a cold smile touching his lips. Maybe I will. Good day, Mr. Everett. Samuel waited until the man left before collapsing into his chair, hands shaking. That evening he sought out Jenkins at the livery stable, warning him about Hargrove's questions. Jenkins, a weathered man in his 50s, took the news with grim resignation. Been expecting something like this, he said, glancing toward the back of the stable where Miller worked. Valley's getting more traffic these days, bound to get some trouble eventually. What do we do? Samuel asked. Jenkins sighed. Keep our heads down, hope he moves on. If not, he shrugged. Miller and I have a place picked out further north, been preparing for years just in case. Samuel found Walsh at the boarding house, pulling him aside to relay Hargrove's questions and his conversation with Jenkins. To his frustration, Walsh didn't seem to share his alarm. Hargrove's one man passing through, Walsh said. He'll be gone in a week or two. And if he says something to others before he goes? Plant suspicion, Samuel demanded. It only takes one accusation to start something we can't stop. Walsh gripped Samuel's shoulders. You're letting fear rule you again. We've been careful. There's nothing he can prove. I won't wait for proof, Samuel hissed, pulling away. I've seen what happens when men like him decide to make examples of men like us. Their argument continued in harsh whispers until Mrs. Thornton's approaching footsteps forced them to separate. Samuel left without resolution, returning to his cabin alone for the first time in weeks. The next day brought more tensions. Samuel saw Hargrove talking with several local men outside the saloon, their glances toward the post office too frequent to be coincidental. When Walsh appeared for their usual brief conversation about mail delivery, Samuel cut him short. Not today, he said under his breath. Hargrove's watching. Walsh's jaw tightened, but he nodded and left without argument. That evening, instead of returning to his cabin, Samuel rode out to Jenkins' place to warn him that Hargrove seemed to be gathering support among some of the town's men. He returned to find his cabin door ajar, light spilling from within. Samuel approached cautiously, hand on his revolver, only to find Walsh sitting at his table. What are you doing here? Samuel demanded, closing and locking the door behind him. It's not safe. Walsh looked up, his expression unusually serious. Hargrove cornered me today. Asked some pointed questions about my relationship with you. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. What did you tell him? That you're helping me establish a small freight business. That we're considering a partnership. Walsh ran a hand through his hair. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't, Samuel snapped. You've been here over a month with no visible means of support, spending time with me, with Jenkins and Miller. What did you expect? I expected to be allowed to live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. Walsh stood, frustration clear in his movements. I'm tired of running, Samuel, tired of pretending. Then you'll end up dead, Samuel said bluntly. Or worse, you'll get others killed alongside you. This isn't just about us. Walsh crossed to him, taking Samuel's face between his hands. Come away with me. Samuel blinked. What? Come away with me, Walsh repeated. I have land in northern Idaho Territory, a homestead claim remote with good water and timber. We could have a life there, Samuel, a real life. Samuel pulled away. You never mentioned land before. Because I wasn't sure you'd ever consider leaving with me, Walsh admitted. But now, with Hargrove stirring trouble, it might be time. Samuel paced the small confines of the cabin, mind racing. I can't just abandon my position. People depend on the mail. Someone else will take the job, Walsh said. This isn't about the mail, Samuel. This is about you being afraid to reach for happiness. The accusation stung because it contained too much truth. Samuel turned on him. It's easy for you to talk about reaching for happiness. You've had it before with that man in Wyoming, perhaps others. I've spent my life running before anything could even begin. And now something has begun, Walsh said quietly. Something worth fighting for, worth changing your life for. Samuel stared at him, at this man who had crashed into his carefully constructed isolation and shattered every defense. I don't know if I can, he whispered. Walsh nodded slowly, pain evident in his eyes. Then I can't stay and watch you wall yourself away again. I'll leave tomorrow, head north to my land, alone if I must. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. If you change your mind, I'll wait at the North Fork of Sweetwater Creek for 3 days. After that, I'll assume you've made your choice. After Walsh left, Samuel sat at his table until dawn, staring at nothing, torn between the safety of isolation and the terrifying possibility of a shared life. The next day brought fresh tensions to Sweetwater Creek. Samuel opened the post office to find a crude drawing pinned to the door, 2 male figures in a vulgar embrace, with no signature but clear enough in its message. He tore it down before anyone else could see it, his hands shaking with rage and fear. By midday, word reached him that Hargrove and several local men had confronted Jenkins at the livery stable, resulting in a fistfight that left Jenkins with a bloody face and Miller threatening the group with a shotgun before they retreated. When Samuel closed the post office that evening, he found Walsh's landlady waiting for him, her face pinched with worry. Mr. Walsh asked me to give you this, Mrs. Thornton said, handing him a folded paper. He's left town. Such a shame, seemed a nice young man despite what they're saying. Samuel's stomach dropped. What are they saying? Mrs. Thornton lowered her voice. Mr. Hargrove has been spreading ugly rumors. I don't believe them myself, but, she shook her head. People talk. Mr. Walsh thought it best to move on. After she left, Samuel unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Inside was a crude map showing the route to the North Fork, with a simple message, 3 days. Samuel returned to his cabin to find it had been broken into, his belongings scattered, and a message scrawled on the wall. Sodomites burn. He stood in the doorway, staring at the hateful words as something shifted inside him. The fear that had ruled him for so long suddenly transformed into cold fury, not just at the anonymous vandals, but at himself for allowing fear to dictate his entire existence. Working quickly, Samuel gathered essential supplies and his meager savings. He left a brief note of resignation on the post office door and slipped out of town before dawn, riding north toward the fork of Sweetwater Creek. He rode hard through the day, constantly checking behind for pursuers, taking detours when the trail became too exposed. By late afternoon, exhaustion and heat had taken their toll, and Samuel stopped at a small stream to rest his horse and drink. The sound of approaching riders sent him scrambling for cover. From behind a stand of cottonwoods, Samuel watched as 3 mounted men came into view, Hargrove among them, rifles across their saddles. Should be close, one man was saying. Thornton woman said he headed this way. Filthy degenerate probably went to find his lover, Hargrove spat. We'll find him, and then we'll teach him what happens to men who pervert nature. Samuel remained motionless until they passed, then waited another hour before continuing, now moving more cautiously through the gathering darkness. His horse stumbled on the increasingly rough terrain, and Samuel realized he was losing the trail as night closed in. The temperature dropped rapidly with the sun, and Samuel found himself shivering, his thin coat inadequate against the mountain chill. He pressed on, determined to reach the fork before stopping, but as the moon rose, he was forced to acknowledge he was hopelessly lost. Exhausted and chilled to the bone, Samuel dismounted to walk his tired horse. His foot caught on an unseen root, sending him sprawling into a shallow ravine. Pain shot through his ankle as he tried to stand, and he fell back with a groan. "Not now," he muttered, trying again with the same result. His ankle wouldn't bear his weight, and the night was growing colder by the minute. Samuel managed to crawl to a more sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock, pulling his coat tighter around himself as his horse nickered nervously above. He thought of Walsh waiting at the fork, of Hargrove and his men searching the trails, of the life he'd almost been brave enough to claim. As darkness and cold pressed in, Samuel fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep in these conditions could mean death. But exhaustion and pain eventually won, pulling him into unconsciousness as the temperature continued to drop. He dreamed of warmth and strong arms around him, of a voice calling his name. The dream seemed so real that Samuel struggled to open his eyes, confused to find dawn breaking around him and Walsh's worried face above his own. "Samuel, thank God," Walsh breathed, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you." Samuel blinked, struggling to orient himself. "How did you find me?" "Your horse found me," Walsh explained, helping Samuel to sit up. "Showed up at my camp before dawn. I followed his tracks back to you." He examined Samuel's swollen ankle with gentle hands. "Can you ride?" "Hargrove and his men are looking for us," Samuel warned as Walsh helped him stand, supporting his weight. "They passed me yesterday." Walsh nodded grimly. "I know, they found my camp last night, but I saw them coming and hid. They're working their way along the creek now." With considerable effort, Walsh helped Samuel onto his own horse, then mounted behind him. "We need to reach the high pass before nightfall. There's a trapper's cabin there where we can rest before crossing into Idaho." They rode double through the day, Walsh choosing the most concealed routes, stopping only when necessary to rest the horse. Samuel leaned back against Walsh's solid warmth, the pain in his ankle a constant throb that he endured in silence. "I thought you weren't coming," Walsh said quietly as they picked their way through a dense stand of pines. "When your horse arrived alone, I feared the worst." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. "I almost didn't come, then someone broke into my cabin, left a message on the wall." Walsh's arm tightened around Samuel's waist. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Samuel replied. "It was what I needed to see the hatred made visible, to understand that hiding wouldn't protect me forever." As dusk approached, they reached a small, weathered cabin nestled against a cliff face. Walsh helped Samuel inside, settling him on a rough bunk before tending to the horses and gathering firewood. "Hargrove won't find us here," Walsh said as he built a fire in the small stone hearth. "This place isn't on any maps, and the approach is too difficult to stumble upon by accident." Samuel watched Walsh move around the cabin, his competent hands bringing warmth and comfort to the primitive shelter. "Your land, is it far from here?" Walsh glanced over with a small smile. 3 days' ride if we take it slow with your ankle. It's good land, Samuel, remote but with everything we need." "And if someone finds us there?" Walsh sat beside him on the bunk, taking Samuel's hand in his own. "The nearest settlement is 30 miles away. We'll be business partners to anyone who asks, 2 bachelors sharing the work of a homestead." Samuel studied their joined hands, "And if that's not enough?" "If someone suspects." "Then we'll face it together," Walsh said simply. "But I won't live in fear anymore, Samuel. I won't let men like Hargrove determine how I live my life or who I love." The word hung between them, never before spoken aloud. Samuel looked up to find Walsh watching him with a vulnerability that matched his own. "Is that what this is?" Samuel asked softly. "Love?" Walsh reached up to trace the line of Samuel's jaw with gentle fingers. "For me, yes. I've known it since you carried me half dead from that creek. The question is whether you're finally ready to admit what you feel." Samuel closed his eyes, letting the last of his defenses fall away. "I've never said it before. Never allowed myself to even think it." "Say it now," Walsh urged, his voice a whisper. "Here where it's just us." Samuel opened his eyes, looking directly into Walsh's. "I love you," he said, the words both terrifying and liberating. "God help me, Stephen, I love you." Walsh's smile was like sunrise breaking. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Samuel's. "Then we already have everything we need." They spent 2 days at the trapper's cabin, allowing Samuel's ankle to heal enough for travel. On the third morning, they set out at dawn, crossing the high pass into Idaho territory as the sun climbed into a cloudless sky. The journey to Walsh's land took 4 days, not 3, as they moved carefully through the rugged country, alert for any sign of pursuit. But as they rode farther from Sweetwater Creek, the tension gradually eased from Samuel's shoulders. By the time Walsh pointed out the boundary markers of his claim, Samuel found himself smiling with genuine hope for the first time in memory. The homestead was everything Walsh had promised, a sturdy one-room cabin beside a clear, fast-running stream, with meadows suitable for crops and grazing surrounded by dense forests that offered both protection and resources. Mountains rose on 3 sides, creating a natural fortress around the small valley. "It needs work," Walsh said as they dismounted before the cabin, "but it's ours." Samuel took in the scene, the cabin that needed a new roof in places, the overgrown garden plot, the half-finished corral. "It's perfect," he said, meaning it. They spent the summer and fall making the homestead truly theirs. Samuel's knowledge of maps and territory boundaries complemented Walsh's practical skills in construction and hunting. They repaired the cabin roof, expanded the garden, built proper fencing for the small herd of goats Walsh acquired from a distant trading post. As winter approached, bringing the first snows to the high country, Samuel stood at the edge of their land, watching Walsh split wood for their winter store. 3 months had passed since their escape from Sweetwater Creek, with no sign of pursuit or discovery. Their nearest neighbors, a taciturn Norwegian family 15 miles away, had visited once and accepted without question that 2 men would choose to work a remote claim together. Inside their cabin, a shelf held Samuel's books and maps alongside Walsh's carved wooden figures. Their clothes hung together on pegs along the wall. A single large bed, built by Walsh's hands, stood in the corner, piled with quilts against the coming cold. It wasn't the life Samuel had imagined for himself, it was immeasurably better. Here, behind their own closed doors, they could simply be. The constant vigilance he'd lived with for so many years had gradually eased, replaced by a bone-deep contentment he'd never thought possible. Walsh looked up, catching Samuel watching him, and smiled. He set aside his axe and crossed to where Samuel stood. "What are you thinking about?" Walsh asked, slipping an arm around Samuel's waist. Samuel leaned into him, watching as the first snowflakes began to fall against the darkening sky. "About how I almost missed this, how close I came to letting fear win." Walsh pressed a kiss to his temple, "But you didn't. You found your courage when it mattered most." Samuel turned in Walsh's arms to face him. "I found you," he corrected, "or you found me half dead by a creek." "Either way," Walsh said, snowflakes catching in his dark hair, "we found each other. And I, for one, intend to keep what I've found." Samuel smiled, tilting his face up for a kiss as snow continued to fall around them. "So do I, Stephen, so do I." They walked together back to their cabin, to the home and life they'd built, as the snow began to cover their footprints, erasing all trace of their passage across the wild, beautiful land that had become their sanctuary, their last hideaway found at last.